Hello. Well, here we are back to week 8. We want to pick up where we were in our slides for week 7. We had taken that risk walkthrough, and this week I want us more to how we set up risk reserves and where that comes from. What's the connection between identifying risk and setting up your project reserves for risk and schedule. Week 7 topics. You've taken a look at the assumptions analysis, decisions analysis. I'm sure you have much better insight into some of these techniques now. And in this week, week 8, your case study assignment 2 is available to you, so you can start downloading that and working on that. And then all of a sudden, also we're looking at network analysis as a technique and going into PERT and some other diagramming techniques. All very important, interesting things, and they're very valuable and very instructive when we're going through planning processes and also when we're going through our risk assessment and identifying risk and going through the processes, how we are going to deal with risk and be prepared for it for our project. As I said, apart from our risk walkthrough, we took that example, went through the example, saw what the details are that we were doing, and now we want to address the reserves. How do we establish the reserves? There are two major components to our risk reserves. One is any mitigation costs that come up. In other words, if we identify a risk and we want to mitigate the impact, we want to reduce the impact, and we can determine some action or some cause, something that can take place which can reduce the impact of that risk should it occur, we will institute that mitigation activity. And there's a cost associated with that. And that cost has to be paid for, and it has to be paid for during the project. So any mitigation costs we will add to the project cost. That's not a part of our risk reserve. It is because we're evaluating risks and trying to mitigate the impact of the risk that we develop a cost for the mitigation. But that gets directly added into the project cost, the project budget. Then we have what's remaining is our mitigated risk impacts. What is the total sum of the mitigated risk impacts after we've done any mitigation? And the sum of that is what we add to our project risk reserve. And there are two elements of that, and one is cost and one is schedule. In other words, when there's a risk and there's a risk impact, remember we have to look at what is its impact to the project cost and what is its impact to the project schedule. And we want to set up reserves for that. We want to have some schedule in our back pocket. We want to have a risk budget in our back pocket that we can use should that risk event occur. I want to make a point here that risk reserve is to address risk and risk only. I have known some project managers that will take that reserve and consider that to be fundamentally their slush fund that they can use for scope or for overruns or doing some favors or taking an extra trip or doing this or doing that. And that is totally a violation to the discipline of managing your risk reserve. Any contingency funds that are needed for additional travel, unbudgeted monies that are required for travel or other activities that are within the scope of the project should be prepared for and reserved in the project budget itself. However, the reserve that is set up to address risk cannot be used for any scope, overruns, or anything else. The only thing it is provided for is to handle the impact of risk. Reserve is self-funded. And what I mean by self-funding is that from the mitigated impact, that impact winds up to be, we add that up, and that is the extra funding that is required for our risk reserve. Companies will fund their reserve for risk, for a company-wide risk, out of profit. In a project, that is not an option because the profit belongs to the company, not to the project. As a part of our total cost for the project, there are two elements. One is the total cost estimate to do and perform the project, and the second element is our risk reserve, is the total risk reserve. I have presented here two actual management spreadsheets, risk reserve spreadsheets, that I have used in actual projects. It is my methodology, my technique of organizing risk in a way that I break it up into the three fundamental elements of schedule, cost, and performance. It's not that the risk impact will only impact schedule or cost or performance. It's primarily the way I've identified the risk as what is the major element that it would impact should the risk event occur, and such as schedule. Taking a look at the top one, the first one, actual risk is adequacy and availability of staffing by both the company and the contractor. So if staffing is not available or not available on time or not adequate, that's a risk. And what I have detailed in this particular risk is that I've evaluated the cost impact should the customer not be able to supply the proper staffing at the right time. And I figure over the course of the project, that might happen as much as impact us by 4 weeks, and that could be at a cost of about $20,000, figuring about $50,000 per week for the activity. For the contractor, it could also happen. I don't think it would be as drastic, and I estimated 3 weeks at about $50,000 or $150,000 as a total risk impact. Now, by establishing what the probability is, in evaluating the customer, the probability was estimated to be about 60%. In other words, it was very likely that it could happen. For the contractor, it was less because the contractor was motivated and there was temporary labor available. There were other sources of labor available should we need to take care of staffing shortfalls or the fact that we had subject matter experts that were not available. And that probability was about 40%. Taking these weighted probabilities, 60% of 200,000, that's 120,000. 40% of 150,000, which is 60,000. 60 and 120 adds up to 180,000. So the weighted cost for that risk element is 180,000. Taking 60% of a 4-week schedule impact is 2.4 weeks, and then a 40% of 3 weeks is 1.2 weeks. You add those together, and that's 3.6 weeks. So therefore, for this first risk on adequacy availability of staffing, the weighted cost impact is $180,000 and the weighted schedule impact is 3.6 weeks. And now you can note that the total of those is less than the total of the raw impact and the raw schedule impact before taking into consideration the probability of the risk occurring. And you can work down through each one of these risks. You notice that there are 11 identified major risks impacting schedule. There are 3 impacting cost and 2 impacting performance. All right, so now if we go down and we go through all those risks, we can see that every one of those risk categories has been evaluated for a cost impact, a raw cost impact, and a raw schedule impact, and each one has set us with it the probability of occurrence, or it's the estimated probability. It's the project manager's judgment of what the probability of this risk occurring is. And if you add that up, it comes out to be about, in this particular project, $3.98 million. 68.6 weeks with a 68% probability, which is pretty hefty. Now, looking at the weighted cost impacts and the weighted schedule impacts after taking the probability into consideration, we can see that total weighted cost impact is now 2.695 million, almost 2.7, which is a 1.2 million less, over 1.2 million less than what it was in the raw impact evaluation. And the weighted schedule impact of 35 weeks is considerably less, almost half of the raw 68.6 weeks. And so we can now look at the weighted cost impact and the weighted schedule impact. And at this point, without any mitigation or any further action, I would say, as a part of the project, that the risk reserve required at this point for the project would be $2.695 million and 35 weeks. And if you look over to the right, you can see that that is highlighted in red. Required reserve contingency budget, $2.695 million, 35.0 weeks. And that is what at this point we would say about this project. And notice the right-hand portion of the page is totally blank, nothing in schedule, cost, performance. In other words, this is our raw risk assessment before we have taken any mitigation into account or tried to mitigate the impact. In other words, to mitigate the impact is to reduce the impact of the risks and further improve the situation. Because at $2.695 million, that's still a lot of money. So now we go to a little later in time. This is about a week later in time when additional evaluation has occurred. The technique of this methodology that I use is if there's any changes from the previous spreadsheet, it is an increase in risk or risk impact, it's in red. If it's a decrease, I put it in green. And you can see that there's a number of red items here, which means that the risk impact has really gone up. Also, you can see that in two cases, we have decided to take some mitigation in order to reduce the impact of the risk. In cost, item 12, contractor overruns, we had estimated that at $1 million, no schedule impact, and there was a 75% probability of that occurring. And so with the weighted impact, 75% of $1 million, we have a weighted cost impact of $750,000. Actually, since there was no schedule impact, that was still at 0 weeks. Our mitigation was to take and have a specialist controller to monitor one of our subcontractors. To do that, it would cost us $60,000 in labor to pay for that person to perform that service. Should we do that, should we spend that money and have that person provide mitigation for that risk, the net impact would be 80%. In other words, our weighted cost impact would now be reduced by another 20%. And so if you move to the right, you can see now the new net weighted cost impact is down to $600,000, and $600,000 is $150 less than the $750, so that's been a good improvement. So for $60,000 in costs, we get $150,000 improvement, and that's a value. That's a good value. So that's why it says okay. That's a small equation in there that checks out the sums to make sure you're not winding up spending more because of mitigation than you're actually improving in risk reduction. So that has gone down to from 750,000 0 weeks to 600,000 0 weeks with the mitigation of adding a labor resource to monitor a subcontractor, and the cost of that labor is $60,000, and that will need to go directly into the project budget because we'll be spending that money. Looking at the second item down under performance is a concern about timeliness and adequacy of training. There was a risk to have inadequate training. What that meant was we would need additional technical support, and the cost on the raw basis would have been 4 weeks at $200,000. That risk had a weighted impact of about a probability of 90%. In other words, it was pretty much, we were pretty positive that was going to happen. Well, 90% then we get a weighted cost impact of $180,000 and 3.6 weeks versus the $200,000 in 4 weeks. To mitigate that risk and improve it even further, it was determined that if we held additional reviews and syllabus requirements for the training program, set up a syllabus for the training of the customer's personnel, we could really improve the impact of that risk. The additional reviews and syllabus requirements, the cost of having performed that labor, those reviews, was $50,000. We'd get a significant improvement in the net impact, it would be reduced by 50%. And going over to the right, you would see now that our $180,000 of weighted cost impact has been reduced to 90,000, and the 3.6 weighted schedule impact has been reduced to 1.8 weeks. So we've received a $90,000 improvement in that risk by spending $50,000. So there was still a net $40,000 savings. However, we do have to put that $50,000 directly into the project budget because we're going to spend that money. Looking now at the sum, you can see that we now have a $110,000, the total of the two mitigations, has to be added to our budget cost baseline. In other words, it's got to go into our budget because we will spend that money. And the required reserve contingency budget has gone up from the previous one you saw. It is now $4.345 million or 50.2 weeks. However, if you look back at the weighted cost impact, the total of it, in the middle of the page, you'll see that was 4.585. So it's down to 4.345. So it's come down $240,000. So that's a good improvement. It's a good start. But there are still other risks up there and other mitigations that can certainly take place. When we talk about risk reserve, how do we get it? Where do we develop the cost? Where do we get the cost from it? During the planning cycle, when you're planning and you're setting up your budget, or your submission for your budget for the project cost, you can also ask for and request and certify, support the fact that you need to have also a risk reserve set aside that will be used for the risk on the project. Many times, though, we get into a project that's already in process and we find out that there's an inadequate risk reserve after we do our risk evaluation. And so often I've used the technique of project tasking. In other words, I go to the individuals that are running various tasks or parts of the projects and I ask them if they're willing to take a task and underrun their budget, their total task budget, by maybe 10% or 5%. And should they do that, then they will get recognized, and I will write a letter recognizing their performance and their contribution of them and the staff that they have working on those tasks, and ensure that copies of those letters get into their personnel file, also to the CEO and their department manager, so that they get the proper recognition. Should they take that tasking and say, okay, they'll underrun by 5%, and they are not able to do that, and they just use their full budget but not overrun, then they wouldn't get the letter. There's no downside for them. They just did their job. Another source of risk reserve comes from the project profit, if it's possible. Sometimes the company will allow a certain portion of the project profit to be set aside to fund the risk reserve. A point to be made at this time is that when the project is over, all funds in the risk reserve that are not spent become profit to the company. They go directly into profit. And should there be a significant amount of funding in there, then as a project manager, I want to make sure that there is recognition by the management of the company of the performance and the service provided by all the project team members, and I try to negotiate a portion of that remaining budget as a bonus that'll be distributed properly to each of the team members in the project, including those that are no longer on the project but did serve and do good service. There can also be a negotiated risk pool. Sometimes the CFO decides that all the project risks are going to go into one kitty and that CFO is going to manage that. That's really not an equitable way to do it, because usually when the project manager comes to the CFO and says,